Let me tell you something before I start. I have stood on 17 different worlds. I have breathed air that tasted like copper and sulfur, and once, on a moon called Yeth, something that smelled like a dentist's office, clean and wrong at the same time. I have seen things that no word in any human language was built to describe. Big things. Old things. Things that made me feel like a dust particle floating through a cathedral the size of a solar system. But nothing, not one single thing across all those worlds and all those years, ever made me feel the way I felt the afternoon the Vorkai Emperor stood in front of 40,000 of his finest warriors, and got the lesson of his very long, very arrogant life handed to him by one tired, dirty, limping human sergeant. That sergeant was not me, by the way. I want to be clear about that up front, because people keep getting confused when I tell this story. I was there. I watched every second of it from about 40 feet away. But the man who actually did it, the man who stood there in the middle of that alien parade ground and just refused to bend, that was Sergeant First Class Emil Reyes. And Emil Reyes, God bless him, was the most unremarkable-looking man you have ever seen in your life. Part 1. The Setup. We had been on Vorin 9 for 11 days before the confrontation. I need to give you some context, because if I just jump straight to the moment, you won't understand why it mattered so much. Context is everything with the Vorkai. You have to understand who they are, or who they think they are, to understand why what happened that day hit them so hard. The Vorkai are not small. That's the first thing anyone tells you in the briefings. The first slide of every Vorkai tactical presentation is just a photograph of a Vorkai soldier standing next to a standard-issue human Marine. The Marine, who is not a short man, comes up to roughly the midpoint of the Vorkai soldier's chest. The Vorkai in the photo has the expression of someone who is very deliberately not laughing. They average around 9 feet tall. Their skin is a deep blue-gray, like the sky over the ocean right before a serious storm. They have 4 arms, 2 primary, 2 smaller secondary limbs that fold against the torso when not in use. Their eyes are amber-colored, almost gold, and they have this quality where they catch the light in a way that makes it seem like the Vorkai is always looking at you from the inside of a searchlight. Their faces are flat across the nose and broad across the jaw, and when they are displeased, which is frequent, the ridge of bone above their eyes drops forward in a way that makes them look like a cliff face about to avalanche. They are also, it should be said, extremely old as a civilization. They've been spacefaring for somewhere around 6,000 years. They have an empire that spans 43 systems. They have a military tradition that goes back so far that the earliest documented Vorkai battle was fought before humans had invented the wheel. They are, in short, very used to being the biggest thing in any room. Which is why, when humanity made first contact 80 years ago, the Vorkai did something that would define every interaction we've had with them since. They laughed. Not a polite diplomatic chuckle, not a dismissive sniff, a full, genuine, absolutely delighted laugh, the kind of laugh that comes from real surprise. The Vorkai High Council, when they received the first human transmission, our slow, clunky, beautifully earnest first attempt at saying hello, "We are here. Please don't kill us," reportedly played it 17 times in a row in their council chamber, and laughed every single time. They thought we were adorable. They thought we were the galactic equivalent of a kitten that had wandered into a wolves' convention. For 80 years they tolerated us. That is genuinely the word their diplomatic records use. Tolerated. They traded with us sometimes. They ignored us when they could. They occasionally sent what they called advisory missions to human-controlled space, which were less advisory and more the galactic equivalent of someone looking over your shoulder while you're trying to do your homework, making little disapproving sounds. But they had never, in 80 years, made an open military move against humanity. That changed 6 months before the events I'm about to describe. What changed, it was a system called Reach 7. Reach 7 is a 7-planet system in a sector of space that, when I say it's in dispute, what I mean is that 3 different civilizations all want it, and are all pretending the dispute is about law and precedent, when it is actually about a very dense asteroid belt in the outer system that is absolutely packed with materials that every ship drive currently in production depends on. Humanity had a mining operation there. Small, 40 workers, 2 processing stations, 1 defense platform that the defense platform operators themselves described as decorative because it had never actually been tested in combat. The Vorkai decided, 6 months prior to our deployment, that Reach 7 was theirs. They had some claim, 300 years old, predating human spaceflight entirely, that their legal scholars had dusted off and polished up and presented to the Galactic Assembly with the absolute confidence of people who have never once in 6,000 years had to worry about a legal argument not going their way. The Galactic Assembly, which is the closest thing our part of the galaxy has to an international court, did not rule in the Vorkai's favor. That had also never happened before. The Vorkai, according to every report I have seen and every briefing I attended, were genuinely stunned. Not angry initially, just stunned, like a very large, very powerful animal that has walked into a glass door it didn't know was there. Then came the anger. The Vorkai Emperor, Emperor Doravaak III, ruler of 43 systems, descended from a military dynasty so long and so decorated that his family crest has run out of room for new honors, and they've started adding them in smaller and smaller script, declared that the Assembly's ruling was invalid. He declared that humanity's claim was fraudulent. He declared that his military would be repositioning to enforce what he called the true and legal boundaries of Vorkai territory. In less diplomatic language, he declared war. Not officially. He never used the word. Vorkai politicians are very good at not using the words that mean what they mean. But he moved 40,000 soldiers to Threshold Station Voron 9, which sits at the edge of the Reach 7 system, and he announced that he would be receiving the formal transfer of administration of the system there. There was no transfer scheduled. He had just invented one. He was planning to stand in front of 40,000 soldiers and declare that whatever happened in that room was the legitimate handing over of a territory that no one had agreed to hand over. It was a performance, a very expensive, very carefully staged political performance, designed to create a fact on the ground before anyone could argue about it. And humanity, in its infinite wisdom, decided to send a delegation. A small one. 7 people. I was one of them. The briefing was held on a ship called the Resolute, 3 days out from Voron 9. The briefing room smelled like recycled air and old coffee, the kind of smell that becomes so familiar on long deployments that you stop noticing it until you're back somewhere that smells like the actual outdoors. And then you notice that you've forgotten what the actual outdoors smells like. And then you feel a very specific kind of sad. Our mission commander was Colonel Yuki Tanaka. She was a woman of about 50, with silver-streaked black hair she kept pulled back tight, and the manner of someone who has long since stopped being impressed by things that are merely dangerous, and has graduated to only being impressed by things that are actually impossible. She had a scar along her jaw that she'd gotten on Keplerii, and she wore it the way some people wear medals, not with pride exactly, but with acknowledgement. She stood at the front of the briefing room and looked at the 7 of us for a long moment before she spoke. "Let me be clear about what we are doing," she said. "We are not there to negotiate. The time for that has passed. We are not there to fight. We do not have the numbers for a fight, and I would like us all to go home eventually. We are there to witness, to stand inside whatever ceremony the Emperor has planned to make clear by our presence that humanity will not simply be absent while its territories are being stolen, and to file a full and documented record of everything that happens." She paused. "We are also there," she said more quietly, "to not be humiliated." She let that sit for a second. The Emperor is going to try to humiliate us. He is going to make the delegation stand while his court sits. He is going to address us last, after the most junior members of his staff. He is going to conduct this ceremony as though we are a minor inconvenience rather than the representatives of the civilization he is stealing from. This is calculated. It is designed to produce images and recordings that will be broadcast across 43 systems showing humanity kneeling, functionally speaking, before Vorkai power. She looked at each of us in turn. "We will not kneel," she said. "Not literally, not functionally, not in any way that can be recorded or reported or remembered. Whatever they do, we stand straight. We do not flinch. We do not react. We do not give them the image they are trying to create. Is that understood?" It was understood. Sergeant First Class Emil Reyes was sitting 2 seats to my left during that briefing. He was taking notes on a small physical pad. He was old-fashioned about some things, Emil, and I remember watching him write something down and then look up at the colonel with an expression that I would have called, if I'd had to name it at the time, quiet consideration. Emil was 43 years old. He had been in service for 22 years. He was medium height, medium build, the kind of person your eyes slide off of in a crowd because there is nothing obviously remarkable about him to make them stick. Brown hair going gray at the temples, dark eyes, a face that had seen enough weather to know what weather looked like from the inside. He had also, and this is the part I only learned afterward, from his service file, been awarded the Crimson Star twice, both times for situations that involved standing between his unit and something very large and very angry and not moving until the people behind him were safe. He had also, at some point in his early 20s, been part of a unit that spent 14 months as prisoners of a species called the Keth, who are not in this story but who are, by any measure, significantly worse than the Vorkai in terms of how they treat their captives. He had been tortured, in other words. He had been kept in conditions that the subsequent inquiry described with the kind of flat, clinical language that medical reports use, when the reality of what they're describing is so bad that using ordinary human language to describe it would feel like an insult to ordinary human language. And Emil Reyes had survived that, had come out the other side, had re-enlisted 6 months after his medical discharge because, and these are his words from his service record, there was more to do. I did not know most of this during the 11 days we spent on Voron 9 before the confrontation. I knew Emil by reputation. I knew he was steady and quiet, and the kind of soldier you wanted on your left when things went sideways. I did not know the specific dimensions of what he'd survived, or what he was made of underneath that unremarkable exterior. I was about to find out. Part 2, Voron 9. Threshold Station Voron 9 is not a planet. It's a station massive, constructed in 5 distinct rings around a central hub, each ring about 1 kilometer in diameter, and connected by struts the width of a small building. The whole thing is anchored by a gravity anchor to a dead moon that orbits in the outer edge of the Reach 7 system, and when you approach it from space, it looks like someone took a very old clock apart and then reassembled it in 3 dimensions, and then made it about the size of a small city. The Vorkai built it 400 years ago. It was originally a military way station, a place for fleets to resupply and regroup before pushing further into what was then the frontier of their expansion. It's been repurposed multiple times since, and in the last century it's functioned as something between a neutral diplomatic ground and a trade hub, which means it's full of a complicated mix of species and agendas and smells. God, the smells on a multi-species station are something else. There's a section near the central hub where 3 different food preparation areas are within about 50 meters of each other, and the overlap of what those 3 species consider edible, and the smells those preparations produce is, look, I've told people about it and the best I can do is, imagine if something burning and something rotting and something fermenting were all happening at the same time, but none of them smelled bad exactly, just deeply, fundamentally alien. We arrived on the second ring. Our quarters were in a section the station administration had designated for the human delegation, a set of rooms that had clearly been prepared by people who had looked up human accommodation and then done their best, which meant the bunks were approximately the right size, but the lighting was too blue, and the temperature controls defaulted to something about 8 degrees cooler than most humans prefer. We spent the first evening arguing with the environmental interface. I remember that first night on Vorin 9 clearly. I was sitting on my bunk. The mattress had the consistency of a firm handshake, which is not comfortable but is at least decisive, looking out the viewport at the dead moon anchoring the station. It was gray and pocked and utterly featureless, the kind of landscape that doesn't even bother to be interesting in its desolation. Emil was on the bunk across from me, reading. He read a lot. Physical books, same as the physical notepad. He had a small collection of them that he carried in a waterproof case, which everyone teased him about until they wanted to borrow one. "What do you think they're going to do?" I asked him. He looked up. "The Vorkai," he considered. "Exactly what the colonel said. Big ceremony, try to make us feel small, lots of recording equipment. They'll position us badly in the room so that when they broadcast the footage, it looks like we're subordinated. And then they'll announce that Reach 7 is theirs, and we'll file our record of the proceedings with the assembly, and it becomes a legal document showing they conducted an illegitimate ceremony, and the political fight continues." "You think that's all?" He went back to his book. "Probably," he said. "But," he turned a page, "the Emperor is personally attending. He didn't have to do that. He could have sent a minister, a general, anyone. The fact that he's here himself, that's about more than territory. That's about making a point." "What point?" Emil was quiet for a moment. "That we're not worth taking seriously," he said. "That's the point he wants to make. That's what the whole ceremony is about. He wants 40,000 soldiers and however many broadcast systems to record the moment when humanity was there, in the room, and just," he made a small gesture with his hand, "absorbed into the background." I looked at the dead moon. "That's a lot of effort to make one point," I said. "He's been ruling for 200 years, Emil said. "That's a long time to accumulate a need to be right." The ceremony was scheduled for the 11th day. In the 10 days before it, we were given what the Vorkai called orientation access to the station, which meant we were allowed to move through certain sections, under escort within certain hours. Our escorts were Vorkai soldiers. 4 of them always, rotating in shifts. They were professional, perfectly professional. They didn't speak to us unless we asked them a direct question, and when we did, their answers were complete and accurate and utterly devoid of any quality that might be mistaken for warmth. I learned a lot in those 10 days by watching rather than talking. The Vorkai military has a physical culture that is, I want to use the right word here, total. It's not just that they train hard, though they do. It's that their entire social structure is organized around martial concepts. Rank is everything. Position is everything. The way a Vorkai soldier stands in relation to another Vorkai soldier communicates volumes. Who is senior, who is junior, who is being honored, who is being subtly disrespected. And I noticed, over those 10 days, that the way they positioned themselves in relation to us was very deliberate. They always stood slightly above us if there was any elevation to exploit. They always oriented their bodies so that the angle of their shoulders communicated in their own body language, a kind of passive superiority. They were never rude, never overtly aggressive, but every physical positioning was a tiny, careful statement of dominance. The interesting thing, and I filed this in my daily report, which is part of why I'm mentioning it, was that Emil noticed it too. More than noticed it, he was cataloging it. I watched him, over those 10 days, make very small, very deliberate adjustments in how he carried himself. Not aggressive adjustments. He wasn't trying to challenge them. He was just refusing to accommodate the positioning. If they angled to stand above him, he shifted so the angle was equalized. If they positioned him to be walking slightly behind the group, he drifted back into the middle. Small things. Nothing you could point to, but consistent. I watched one of our escorts notice it on the 8th day. Just a brief moment, his amber eyes tracking to Emil, something calculating in the expression, and then neutral again. I thought about that look later. That Vorkai soldier had noticed that something was off, but he couldn't quite name what it was. He just knew that this human wasn't quite doing what humans were supposed to do. Part 3. The morning of. The morning of the ceremony, we were given a briefing by a Vorkai administrative officer. A very tall, very thin Vorkai woman with the kind of posture that made me feel like I had been walking wrong my entire life. She laid out the schedule and the positioning in a tone of absolute authority. Our delegation would stand in the western gallery of the main ceremonial hall. This was, as Colonel Tanaka's expression made very clear, a bad position. The western gallery was set back from the main floor, elevated on a step, but separated from the primary viewing area by a decorative screen that was, artistically speaking, very beautiful, and practically speaking, meant that anyone watching the ceremony from the main floor would have to actively look through a screen to see us. We would technically be present and functionally be invisible. There would be a brief moment, the administrative officer explained, where the Emperor's Chamberlain would acknowledge the human delegation. This would be, she said without any particular emphasis, after the acknowledgement of the various trade representatives, station administrators, and military observers. Colonel Tanaka asked, very calmly, whether there would be an opportunity for the human delegation to address the assembly. The administrative officer said, equally calmly, that the ceremony schedule did not include a period for delegation statements. Colonel Tanaka said she understood. She did not say it in a way that suggested she was okay with it. We were given 2 hours to prepare. We went back to our quarters. In those 2 hours, the colonel held a private briefing for the 7 of us. She was precise and she was calm, and she said the same things she'd said on the resolute, hold your posture, hold your expression, give them nothing to film, but she said them differently this time. There was something in the quality of her voice, not fear exactly, but a kind of weight. They've rigged this very carefully, she said. The screen in the Western Gallery is not decorative. It's deliberate. It will show up in footage as a visual barrier between us and everything else. The position acknowledgement timing is deliberate. By the time they get to us, the emotional peak of the ceremony will be over and everyone will be focused on the next segment. Everything about this is designed to produce a specific visual and narrative record. She paused. What I want, she said, is for us to be so visibly, obviously, publicly present that the screen becomes an insult visible to everyone watching. I want us positioned at the front of that gallery at the screen rather than behind it. I want every one of us standing straight for the full duration. I want no reactions, no adjustments, no looking around. When they acknowledge us, I want the acknowledgement to look, on the broadcast, like they are being forced to acknowledge people who were never going to be invisible. She looked at us. This is a performance, she said. They've written a script where we're background. I want us to be the only thing people remember. I will be honest with you about something. I was nervous that morning in a way that I don't usually get nervous before things. I've been in situations that were objectively much more physically dangerous than a ceremony with 40,000 soldiers who weren't there to fight me. I've been in firefights. I've been on worlds where the atmosphere was trying to kill me. I've done things that my brain was fairly certain were not survivable. But there's something about a deliberate, choreographed humiliation, in front of cameras, in front of thousands of witnesses, with the specific intent of producing a permanent record of your people being diminished. That gets into your head in a different way than danger does. Danger you can react to. Humiliation you just have to stand in. I was thinking about this while I was getting into my dress uniform. It's not a flashy uniform. Human military dress is understated by galactic standards, which the Vorkai aesthetic team had probably planned for, since our 7 humans in our quiet dark uniforms standing behind a decorative screen would read very clearly as not important on a broadcast. Emil was also getting into his dress uniform. He was moving with the same quality of ease he always moved with, not fast, not slow, just steady, the way water moves through rock, not around it, through it. I said, "You good?" He said, "Yeah." I said, "Not nervous?" He looked at me for a second. "Of course I'm nervous," he said, "but it doesn't change what you do." I thought about that. "What do we do?" I asked. He finished adjusting his collar. "We stand there," he said, "and we make sure everyone in that room understands that we saw exactly what was done to us, and we're still standing." Part 4. The Hall. The main ceremonial hall of Threshold Station Voron 9 is, by any objective measure, extraordinary. It's built into the central hub of the station, and the ceiling, if you can call it that, since it's more of a dome, is transparent, giving a direct view of open space. On a station anchored to a dead moon on the edge of a disputed system, this means you look up and you see the moon, and beyond it the deep black of space with the system's star as a distant bright point, and it has the effect of making everything that happens inside the hall feel simultaneously enormous and very small. The floor is dark stone, some Vorkai material I never got the name of, polished to a mirror surface that catches the light from the dome and scatters it. When 40,000 Vorkai soldiers are assembled in that hall, their armor, a deep cobalt blue, engraved with unit designations in a script I can't read but which looks like compressed geometry, angles and precise curves, catches the scattered light and the whole assembly shimmers. 40,000 soldiers. When I walked into the Western Gallery and looked out through the decorative screen at that assembly, the number became real in a way it hadn't been when it was just a number in a briefing document. 40,000, arranged in precise formations that stretched from the ceremonial dais at the far end all the way to the walls, filling the hall with a density and discipline that made the air feel different, heavier. Like the collective intention of 40,000 highly trained warriors, was a physical property of the atmosphere. And it was quiet. That was the thing I wasn't prepared for. 40,000 soldiers and the sound was almost nothing. Some ambient hum from the station machinery. The faint sound of breathing, multiplied into a soft collective presence. But no shuffling, no muttering, no restlessness. They stood with their hands at their sides and their eyes forward, and the entire assembly was still in the way that very powerful, very disciplined things are still, not passive, but controlled. I felt it in my chest, not fear exactly, something older than fear, something that lives below words. Colonel Tanaka positioned us at the front of the gallery at the screen, exactly as she'd said. I was third from the left. Emil was immediately to my right. I remember thinking, here we go. The ceremony began. I'll spare you the full details because they would take as long to describe as they took to endure, and some of what the Vorkai do in their formal ceremonies requires three-dimensional context that is hard to convey in words. The broad outline is, there was a processional, there was a declaration of gathering. There was an extended acknowledgement of the Vorkai military units assembled, which was done by a series of officers who called out unit designations and received responses that rippled through the assembly in waves of sound. The Emperor entered 40 minutes into the ceremony. Emperor Doravaak III was not the largest Vorkai I had seen during our 11 days on the station, but he had a quality that made him feel larger than he was. He was dressed in armor that was ceremonial rather than functional, All the engineering of Vorkai battle armor translated into something made for display, with the same engraved geometry but worked in materials that caught the light differently, so that when he moved, the patterns shifted like something alive. He wore a crown, the Vorkai equivalent of one, a structure that sits on the ridge of bone above the eyes rather than on the skull, made of a material that was either very dark metal or very dark crystal. I couldn't tell which from the gallery. He walked to the dais at the far end of the hall and turned and faced 40,000 soldiers, and for a long moment he simply stood and looked at them, and they looked at him, and it was one of those silences that has weight. Then he raised both of his primary arms, a sweeping gesture that I later learned meant, in Vorkai formal language, something like "you are mine and I am yours, and this is the thing that does not change," and the assembly made a sound. I will try to describe the sound. Imagine standing at the edge of a cliff and having the wind hit you all at once, not a gust, a wall of air, a sudden physical presence. Now translate that into sound. That's as close as I can get. 40,000 armored soldiers making a simultaneous vocal response to their emperor's gesture, and the dome above amplifying it, and the whole thing arriving in the chest before it arrives in the ears. My vision blurred for half a second. It was that intense. I steadied, looked straight ahead. Next to me, Emil did not move at all. The acknowledgements began. Trade representatives first. There were 12 of them, from 8 different species, and each acknowledgement was accompanied by a formal statement of their position and their relationship to Vorkai interests. The trade representatives were positioned to the east of the main dais, in a proper viewing gallery, not behind a screen. When the chamberlain called their names, they stepped forward slightly and bowed, a Vorkai-style formal bow, which is a deep forward angle of the upper body, with the secondary arms crossed over the chest. After the trade representatives came the station administrators, then the independent military observers, representatives from 3 other species, none of whom are human, then the assembly documentation staff. The whole time, the chamberlain's voice carried through the hall with perfect amplification, clear and resonant, and every acknowledgement was responded to by the assembly with a precise, measured sound that meant, as nearly as I can translate it, "You are witnessed." It took an hour and 20 minutes to reach the human delegation. An hour and 20 minutes of standing at a decorative screen, while every other delegation in the hall was acknowledged with their proper names and their proper significance and their proper place in the proceedings. I was tired. My feet hurt. The gallery step we were standing on was elevated at an angle that was ever so slightly wrong for human anatomy, and after an hour of standing on it, the particular muscles in my calves that had to compensate for the angle were sending very politely worded complaints to my brain. I did not move. None of us moved. I snuck one look at Emil during that hour and 20 minutes. Just one, for about half a second, because if I was going to be standing at a screen behind the colonel, I was going to at least not be turning my head around like a tourist. He was looking at the emperor. Not at the assembly, not at the ceremony, not at the chamberlain doing the acknowledgments. He was looking at the emperor, who stood on the dais in his crystalline armor, watching his own ceremony with the expression of someone watching something they had written themselves and know will end well. Emil's expression was, I'm trying to find the right word. Not angry, not afraid, not neutral exactly, because neutral has a blankness to it and this was the opposite of blank. Reading, maybe. He was reading the emperor the way you read something you're going to need to remember. Part 5, the incident. The chamberlain reached us. The human delegation. That was all, not our names, not our titles. Not the colony we represented or the institution that had sent us. Just the human delegation, pronounced in Vorkai in a way that carries, by grammatical construction, a particular kind of diminutive emphasis that doesn't translate directly but which meant something like, these also minor, brief. Colonel Tanaka stepped forward, half a step, enough to be visible. She did not bow. This was not a mistake. It was a choice we had all been briefed on. The Vorkai bow was theirs, their diplomatic form. We had our own. But the colonel did not execute our diplomatic form either, because our diplomatic form, in the context of this ceremony and this positioning, would have been received as a kind of concession. She just stood straight and let the acknowledgement pass. There was a ripple through the assembly. 40,000 soldiers, most of whom had just watched an hour, and 20 minutes of other delegations respond to their acknowledgement with the proper bow, now watching the human delegation not bow. It was small. If you didn't know what to look for, you'd have missed it. But I was looking for it, and I saw it, a slight shift in the collective posture of the nearest formations. Not hostility, just recalibration. Something had not happened that was supposed to happen. The Chamberlain moved on. And then, about 30 seconds after the ceremony moved on, something changed. The Emperor spoke. Not as part of the ceremony, not through the Chamberlain. He spoke directly, in Vorkai, and the words were picked up by the hall's amplification and carried everywhere, and our translation earpieces rendered it in real time. Hold! The Chamberlain stopped. The hall went very still. The Emperor's gold-amber eyes moved to the Western Gallery, to our screen, to us. He said, in Vorkai, and I'm going to give you the translation that our linguists later confirmed was the accurate one. The small delegation from humanity, you were acknowledged. You did not respond. I want to understand whether this is ignorance or rudeness. In the hall, in the sudden total silence, you could hear the amplification hum very faintly. Colonel Tanaka spoke in English, knowing it would be translated. We had broadcast translation active on our equipment, outgoing and incoming. The human delegation acknowledges your acknowledgement, Emperor. We chose to respond in our own form rather than yours. We intended no rudeness. A pause. The Emperor looked at her for a long moment. Your form, he said, looked very much like nothing. There was a sound from the assembly, a collective sound that, in Vorkai communication, is a kind of agreement, not laughter, but something like it. Shared amusement. 40,000 soldiers finding the Emperor's observation either funny or satisfying. It was hard to tell which. Colonel Tanaka's expression did not change. We were standing, she said. We remained standing throughout. We did not sit, did not lean, did not look away. We gave you our full attention for the duration. Where we come from, that is a form of respect. The Emperor descended one step from the dais. It was a small movement, but it changed the geometry of the hall. The Emperor had been elevated, ceremonially, above everyone in the room. By descending even one step, he was, in Vorkai formal language, entering the space of the assembly rather than commanding it from above. It meant he was going to engage rather than pronounce. In retrospect, I think he thought this was going to be quick. A brief correction, a public illustration of the inadequacy of human understanding, a small, clean, memorable moment. He said, we are told that humanity has a tradition of what you call stubbornness, that you consider it a virtue. Perseverance, Colonel Tanaka said, yes. You are a young species, the Emperor said. 80 years of interstellar contact. We have had 6,000 years of galactic history. You have, he made a gesture that in Vorkai means something like one finger's worth when you're trying to describe a measurement. This much of what we have, and yet you stand behind a screen in a Western gallery and refuse to bow. We stand behind a screen, Colonel Tanaka said, because that's where we were positioned. Another sound from the assembly. You were positioned, the Emperor said, according to your significance to this proceedings. And here is where it happened. Here is the moment. I was watching Colonel Tanaka. I think everyone in our delegation was watching Colonel Tanaka. She was the commander. This was her exchange to manage. She was doing it well, holding her ground, not escalating, giving nothing away. But what happened next did not come from Colonel Tanaka. Emil Reyes stepped forward. Not in front of the colonel. He stepped to her side, her right side, and he spoke. And this is the thing I will never forget for as long I live. He spoke quietly. Not softly, not uncertainly, but quietly. The same way you speak when you don't need volume to be heard because what you're saying has enough weight to carry itself. Our translation broadcast carried it to the whole hall. With respect, Emperor, Emil said, significance is not a fixed point. It's something that gets reassessed. The Emperor's eyes moved to Emil. This is where I need to be very clear about what Emil looked like in that moment, because it matters. He looked like what he was. A medium-height, medium-build, 43-year-old human soldier in a dress uniform that, compared to the crystalline glory of Vorkai ceremonial armor, was approximately as visually impressive as a clean piece of paper. He had no decorations on visible display. Human military dress keeps the serious decorations understated. He had a small pin on his lapel that was the Crimson Star, twice awarded, which the Vorkai would not have known the meaning of. He had dark eyes and a face that had seen weather, and the particular color of gray at a man's temples that comes from years and not from fashion. He looked, in other words, entirely unremarkable. And he stood there in that hall in front of 40,000 Vorkai soldiers and their emperor, and said, quietly, "Your Majesty has been governing for 200 years. In that time, humanity has gone from a single planet to 47 systems. In that same time, the Vorkai Empire expanded by," he looked briefly at the colonel, who gave the smallest nod, 3 systems, "at its current rate of growth." A silence. The Emperor said, with a quality in his voice I hadn't heard before, not anger, but something sharpening, "Growth is not measured in systems." "No," Emil agreed, "it's not. What would you measure it in?" And that question landed differently than anything else that had been said. Because the Emperor had walked into his own ceremony with a script. Every word of the preceding hour and 20 minutes had been written in advance, had followed a plan, had been building toward a specific ending. And this tired-looking, medium-height human sergeant had just asked a genuine question, not a rhetorical challenge, but a real question, and it required a real answer, and there was no prepared real answer in the script. The Emperor descended another step. 2 steps now from his dais, coming into the room as it were. "Military strength," he said, "cultural continuity, institutional memory. These are the measure of a civilization's growth." "We agree on all 3, Emil said. "We have 7.5 billion soldiers we can put into the field within 18 months of a full mobilization order. Our cultural output has quadrupled in the last 40 years, art, music, literature, architecture on 30 new worlds. And our institutional memory," he paused briefly, the pause of someone making a choice about how exactly to say something, "is very good. We remember things for a long time." A different kind of silence. And then Emil said the thing that changed everything. He said it still quietly, still without any particular dramatic emphasis, still in the conversational tone he'd been using throughout. He said, "We remember, for instance, that the Galactic Assembly ruled on Reach 743 days ago. We remember the exact language of the ruling. We remember that the ruling was unanimous, all 37 voting members, which is a thing that has not happened in Assembly history for 60 years. We remember that 3 of those voting members are Vorkai-allied systems, and they voted against Vorkai's claim. And we remember that every moment of today's ceremony is being recorded and filed as a legal document of an action taken in defiance of that ruling." He stopped. The hall was so quiet I could hear the amplification hum. "So we will stand in a Western gallery," Emil said, "behind a decorative screen without bowing, because what we are building here today is a record. And the record will show that we were here, and we saw everything, and we did not bend. And then, and this is the part that I have had people tell me they don't believe, and I understand why they don't believe it because I was there, and I almost don't believe it. Emil looked directly at the Emperor. Not at the assembly, not at the chamberlain, at the Emperor. And he said, "The Western Gallery has an excellent view, Your Majesty. You can see everything from where we're standing." Part 6. What happened next? I want to be honest about the next few minutes, because human storytelling has a tendency to turn these moments into something clean and cinematic. The orchestra swells, the crowd gasps, the villain backs down with a look of grudging respect, and what actually happened was messier and stranger than that. What actually happened was that the Emperor looked at Emil Reyes for a very long time. I have tried to count the seconds, in retrospect, from different people's recollections, and from the broadcast footage. Best estimate is about 45 seconds, which is a very long time for a public silence in a ceremonial hall with 40,000 witnesses. During those 45 seconds, the Emperor did not speak. Emil did not speak. The Chamberlain did not speak. Colonel Tanaka, to her extraordinary credit, did not speak. Nobody in our delegation moved. The assembly was perfectly still. I was aware, during those 45 seconds, of my own heartbeat in a way that you only become aware of it when everything else has gone very, very quiet. I was aware of the dead moon outside the dome. I was aware of the polished dark floor below us reflecting the light from above. And I was watching the Emperor's face. The Vorkai brow ridge, the shelf of bone above the eyes that drops when they're angry, dropped partway. Not fully, but partway. And his gold amber eyes were doing something I had no reference for, some internal process I couldn't read, and I had the thought, sudden and strange, that this was a man, a being who had not been in this position before. Had not, in 200 years of rule, been in a room where someone looked at him, the way Emil Reyes was looking at him. Not defiant, not hostile, just clear, like glass, like someone who has nothing to hide and has decided not to pretend otherwise. The Emperor said, finally, "You are not what we expected." Emil said, "I know." "A beat." "Your species," the Emperor said. "You are not what we expected." Emil said, "We've heard that before." And then, this is the part of the story that historians are going to be writing about for a very long time. The Emperor did something that had no precedent in 6,000 years of Vorkai ceremonial history. He stepped off the dais entirely. 3 steps down, the full descent, into the space of the assembly. And he walked across the ceremonial hall, 40,000 soldiers watching, broadcast systems recording, to the Western Gallery. He walked to the screen. He stood on the other side of it from Emil and looked at him through it. And then with both of his large primary hands, he reached out and moved the screen. It wasn't attached. It was freestanding, decorative, like I said, and he moved it to one side, and suddenly there was nothing between the Western Gallery and the main hall, and Emil and the Emperor were standing 8 feet apart with nothing between them. The Emperor looked at Emil for one more moment. Then slowly, deliberately, in a way that I can only describe as purposeful, he did a Vorkai formal bow. Not a deep one, not a subordinate bow, but a peer bow, the kind that in Vorkai hierarchical body language means, "I acknowledge you as something worth acknowledging." The assembly made a sound. Not the wall of wind sound from before, a different sound, lower, shorter. Something that our cultural translator, who was reviewing footage with us later, said was, in Vorkai group vocal expression, the equivalent of a sharp intake of breath held and then slowly released. 40,000 soldiers just had their understanding of the world shifted about 3 degrees. Emil didn't bow back. This was not rudeness. This was also not a choice he made in the moment, because he had no idea that any of this was going to happen. It was just he was standing still, The way he'd been standing for an hour and 40 minutes, and the Emperor bowed and Emil didn't move. And the Emperor, after a moment, almost smiled, or the Vorkai equivalent. The brow ridge lifted slightly. The amber eyes changed quality. He turned and walked back to his dais. And he said, projecting to the whole hall in Vorkai, "The ceremony is adjourned. The proceedings will be reviewed." And that was it. The Chamberlain made a formal announcement of adjournment. The Emperor returned to the dais and then withdrew through the rear passage. The assembly began, slowly, to shift from ceremonial stillness to the normal movement of a very large gathering of people who have just been told to disperse. And in the Western Gallery, the 7 of us looked at each other. Colonel Tanaka turned to Emil. She didn't say anything for a few seconds. Then she said, "Sergeant Reyes, when we are back on the ship, you and I are going to have a very long conversation about chain of command and the appropriate time to improvise." Emil said, "Yes, ma'am." She turned back to face the hall. "That," she said quietly, "was either the best or worst thing I have ever seen." Part 7. After. The aftermath took months. The formal political aftermath, the negotiations and the filings and the assembly hearings and the Vorkai internal review process, which apparently generated so much documentation that our diplomatic team estimated the paper equivalent would fill a small building. I can't tell you all of it, because a lot of it is still technically under review, and some of it I genuinely don't know because it happened at levels of diplomacy well above a staff sergeant's clearance. What I can tell you is this. The ceremony footage was broadcast. Not in the form the Emperor had planned. The Vorkai State broadcast edited their version, obviously, but the unedited footage, from our equipment, from the assembly observers, from 3 independent press organizations that had been covering the proceedings, that footage was out within 6 hours. And it spread. I don't know if you've ever watched something spread across galactic media networks. It's a strange experience, because the scale is so much larger than anything human media built up to 47 systems, hundreds of inhabited worlds, thousands of separate media organizations, and something that lands right, something that speaks to something real, moves through it faster than you can track. The moment that moved fastest was the Emperor moving the screen. You wouldn't think that would be the one. You'd think the speech or the bow. But the image of the Emperor of the Vorkai Empire physically moving a decorative barrier to look directly at one human sergeant, that image was everywhere, in 43 systems and 17 non-Vorkai civilizations, within 24 hours. Our cultural analysts said it later. The image worked because it was legible across species. You didn't need to understand Vorkai diplomatic body language or assembly legal proceedings to understand what you were seeing. You saw a very powerful being walk across a room to remove an obstacle between himself and something he suddenly needed to look at directly. The meaning was universal. The Vorkai did not withdraw their claim to reach 7. Let me be clear about that. They're not done fighting for it, and neither are we. The legal and political process is ongoing, and it is complicated, and I don't know how it ends. But the ceremony didn't happen. The formal transfer of administration that the Emperor had choreographed never happened, because he adjourned the ceremony before reaching that part. The legal documentation we filed shows a ceremony that began but did not conclude, which means that the Vorkai position that the territory transfer is a fait accompli has no evidentiary basis. This matters enormously, not enough to end the dispute, but enough to continue it on something closer to equal footing. And the Vorkai's internal response was, from what we've been able to learn through diplomatic channels and analysis, significant. The Emperor's political position within the Vorkai High Council weakened. Not catastrophically. He is still Emperor. He will probably be Emperor for another 100 years, given Vorkai lifespans. but the image of him walking across his own ceremonial hall, in front of 40,000 soldiers, to move a screen so he could look at a human sergeant, that image had effects inside the Vorkai power structure that are still being calculated. Some of his generals were reportedly furious, not at humanity, at him, for improvising, for departing from the script, for engaging rather than simply pronouncing and moving on. Others, this is the part I find most interesting, were apparently impressed, not with us necessarily, with the situation, with what Emil had done and how the Emperor had responded to it. There are, and this is deeply unconfirmed, but it's what our intelligence analysis suggests, Vorkai military commanders who came out of that ceremony thinking about humanity differently than they went in. Not as adorable, not as minor, as something worth taking seriously. Which is the thing we were trying to accomplish. I asked Emil about it later. Not right after. Right after was the very long conversation with Colonel Tanaka about chain of command that he had promised her, and which I was not present for, though from Emil's expression afterward I understood it had been thorough. I asked him about a month later, back on a human station in a sector I'm not going to name, over what passed for coffee in the mess hall. We are never going to solve the problem of coffee on long deployments. I have accepted this. The coffee will always be slightly wrong. I said, "What were you thinking when you stepped forward?" He looked at his coffee. "Nothing specific," he said. "I wasn't planning it." "You weren't planning it," I said. "No, I was just listening. And the Emperor said that thing about significance, and I thought that's not true, and I said so. I thought about this. The thing you said about the records and the assembly ruling," I said. "That part seemed planned." "I knew the numbers," Emil said. "We'd all been briefed on them, I just said them." "In front of 40,000 soldiers," I said. "They were already there," he said. "The numbers don't change because of the audience." I looked at him for a long moment. "You knew he'd engage," I said. "The moment you started talking, you knew he was going to engage, and once he engaged, the ceremony couldn't just continue as planned, because he'd turned it into a conversation." Emil was quiet for a beat. "I thought it was possible," he said. "Powerful people, very powerful people, usually don't expect someone to actually talk back. Not calmly, not without aggression. If you're hostile, they have a response for that. If you're submissive, they have a response for that. But if you're just there, present, talking, they have to figure out how to talk back." He drank his bad coffee. "The Keth were the same," he said quietly, "in some ways. I didn't push on that." "What was it like," I asked instead, "when he moved the screen?" Emil looked out at nothing in particular for a moment. "I almost laughed," he said. "Not at him, just the surprise of it. I didn't expect that. I expected, I don't know, more anger, a guard intervention, something designed to end the conversation." "Not that." "Not that." A pause. "When he moved the screen, I think that was him being honest. He'd built the ceremony around not seeing us clearly, and then the conversation made it impossible to continue not seeing us, and the screen was in the way of actually seeing us. So he moved it." "That's not what I expected a Vorkai Emperor to do," I said. "No," Emil said, "me neither, which is why I didn't bow when he did." "Why not?" He looked at me. "Because," he said, "the bow was him acknowledging that he'd underestimated us, and I didn't want to acknowledge that we accepted that because we didn't. We never accepted being estimated wrong. We were always just what we were." I thought about that for a long time. "That's a lot of diplomatic weight for a man who wasn't planning anything," I said. He almost smiled. "I thought of it after," he said. "In the moment I just didn't bow because I didn't know what else to do." Part 8. What it means. I've been asked in the 7 months since Voron 9 what I think it means. For humanity. For the Vorkai situation. for whatever comes next in the Reach 7 dispute and the broader question of where humanity sits in the galactic order. I don't have a clean answer to that. What I have is this. Humanity is, in galactic terms, young. The Vorkai are right about that. 6,000 years of spacefaring civilization versus 80, the numbers speak. The Vorkai have traditions and institutions, an accumulated weight that we can't match in any direct comparison. They have military history that goes back to before our species had written language. They have cultural memory longer than our recorded history. And they have been underestimating us since the day we first said hello. Not because they're stupid. The Vorkai are not stupid. They're one of the oldest and most sophisticated civilizations in this arm of the galaxy, and they got that way by making accurate assessments of things. But there is something about humanity, something specific and strange and hard to quantify, that keeps defeating their assessments. We keep not fitting the model. We keep being something that 6,000 years of galactic experience has not produced a category for. The closest I can come to naming it is this. We are not afraid of the gap between what we are and what we need to become. Every other species the Vorkai have dealt with, every civilization that encountered them from a position of lesser power, did one of a small number of things. They submitted, they fought and lost, they retreated and waited, they formed alliances to compensate for individual weakness. Humanity looked at the gap between us and the Vorkai, and we just kept going. Not because we didn't see the gap. We see it clearly. We are a species that is excellent at seeing exactly how outmatched we are. We just don't stop. Emil Reyes stood in that hall with no armor and no weapons and no backup, in front of 40,000 soldiers and their emperor, and he didn't stop. Not because he wasn't frightened. I believe he was frightened, though he would not put it that way. But because being frightened and stopping are two different choices, and he only ever made one of them. That is what confused the Emperor. That is what moved the screen. The Vorkai have a word, I learned it afterward, from a Vorkai cultural liaison who had been part of the diplomatic follow-up. The word is vorethkan. It doesn't translate directly. The closest approximation is something like the weight of a thing that has not yet arrived. They use it to describe civilizations that are becoming, not what they currently are, but what they are in the process of becoming. It's a concept that in Vorkai thinking carries tremendous significance, because the Vorkai are old enough to have watched civilizations transform over centuries, to have seen the gap between a species' current state and their future potential, and to understand that the gap is not a measure of weakness but of direction. The Vorkai cultural liaison told our diplomatic team that after Voron 9, the Emperor had reportedly used the word vorethkan in a private council meeting when discussing humanity. First time in 80 years of contact. I was a witness. That's what Colonel Tanaka called us, witnesses. We were there to see and to record and to not bend. I'm telling you what I saw. I saw a ceremony built to erase us turned into something different by one tired, quiet man who decided that the thing being said was not true, and said so. I saw 40,000 soldiers watch their emperor walk across a hall to remove a screen that was in the way of seeing. I saw a bow, not defeat, not submission, not even fully respect in the way we'd mean the word, something more like recognition. The acknowledgement from a being who had been governing for 200 years that he had miscalculated. And I saw Emil Reyes stand there, in his plain dress uniform with his small pin, and not respond, because he had never needed to be acknowledged in the first place. He was just there, present, the same person he'd always been, in front of 40,000 witnesses who had never expected someone like him to exist. We were positioned in the Western Gallery. We stood there for an hour and 40 minutes. We did not bow. We did not break. And by the end of it, the screen was gone. I think about the dead moon sometimes. The gray-pocked, featureless dead moon anchoring that station to the edge of a disputed system. I think about looking out at it from my bunk that first night, thinking about what the next 11 days were going to be like. It seemed like a bad omen then. Dead rock in cold space, anchoring a stage for something that was going to go badly for us. But moons are not omens. They're just moons. Rocks doing what rocks do, holding their position, not moving, utterly indifferent to whatever ceremonies are conducted in their shadow. There's something in that, I think. Something about the difference between what things look like from a distance and what they are when you're standing on the ground. The Vorkai from a distance look like 6,000 years of power and military tradition and accumulated authority. And that's not wrong. That's all true. But a ceremony is just a ceremony, and a screen is just a screen. And a Western gallery, if you stand at the front of it and look out, gives you an excellent view of everything that matters. Emil was right about that. He was right about most things that day.